Hello and welcome back. In my last video, part 3 of this Great Tribulation series, we took a tour of the temple from the court of the Gentiles all the way to the most holy place. In today's video, we'll return to Titus' siege on Jerusalem and the total destruction of the city. In part 2 of this series, we left off with Titus preparing to assault the west wall of the Temple Mount after destroying much of the Antonia Tower. Titus's plan was to widen the breach in what was left of the towers so he could get his soldiers quickly onto the Temple Mount and fight the Judeans on a more level area which was to his army's advantage. Titus placed artillery and archers in and around the area what was left of the Antonia. As the Jews were being bombarded, the Romans took down the northern colonnade section of what remained of the Antonia and flooded onto the Temple Mount, and were now on the court of the Gentiles. The taking of this northern wall of the temple was a great defensive loss for the Judean forces. The Romans marched onto the temple courts, and the two armies faced off against each other, with the Jews having the temple now at their backs. The Judeans knew they were now in serious trouble, but if that wasn't bad enough, another bad omen occurred to discourage the Judean army. The entire time of the siege, during the heavy fighting and bloodshed, and when people were starving to death in the streets, the priests continued to make offerings to their God in the temple. But on the 5th of August, as the Jews stood face to face against their enemy on the temple courts, the animal sacrifices and offerings to their God ran out, as they now had no animals remaining to offer on the altar. The Jews, in their desperate situation, now lost all connection to their God. With no blood sacrificed today, the Jews have no lawful way of atoning for their sin. Passover is still observed, but without the sacrifice. Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, is still on the calendar, but there is never an offering made for sin. The stipulations of the Mosaic Law remain unchanged, but the Jewish people cannot make things right with God. They cannot find forgiveness without an animal sacrifice. The fact remains that there is no forgiveness without the shedding of blood, as stated in Hebrews 9 verses 22, where it says, "Indeed, under the law, almost everything is cleansed with blood, and without the shedding of blood there is no forgiveness." The animal sacrifices of the old law covenant have been replaced by the sacrifice for sin provided by Jesus, the Messiah, on the cross. If a person does not accept what Jesus did for us on the cross, then that person's sins remain on him, and he cannot receive salvation. Speaking about Jesus, Paul said in Acts chapter 4, verse 12, "And in no one else is there salvation, for there is no other name under heaven that has been given among people by which we must be saved." Also in Hebrews chapter 9, verse 15, it says, "And for this reason he is the mediator of a new covenant, so that since a death has taken place for redemption from the transgressions that were committed under the first covenant, those who have been called will receive the promise of the inheritance in the age to come." Or the age to come, obviously he's referring to the kingdom of God there. So unless the Jews accept Jesus' ransom sacrifice for their sins, they have no forgiveness. So the Jews who have not accepted what Jesus did on the cross are left in a very serious predicament. Thankfully, end-time prophecies state that many Jews will come to faith in Christ and find salvation during the Great Tribulation period. I will be discussing that prophecy regarding the Jews soon in another video. Meanwhile, back to the war. The Romans now held the north of the temple, and the Jews held the south, inside what now became an enormous gladiatorial arena. The temple area was held by the Jewish defenders. The sacred temple was now being used as a base for war. On the morning of August 9th, in spite of being exhausted by fighting and starved from famine, the Jews attacked the Roman front lines. The Romans braced against the attack, and Titus once again unleashed his cavalry. In spite of the cavalry charge, the Jews fought on desperately, and so commenced the third battle of the temple. Mass confusion ruled the battle, as a series of attacks and counterattacks occurred by both sides. Jewish forces shot arrows from the walls of the temple, and the Romans did the same from their own rear lines. The fighting continued on for several hours, ending in an uneasy stalemate. The next day, on the morning of August 10th, the Jews once again began the attack on Roman lines, starting the fourth battle for the temple. The battle was intense, but the Romans' counterattack pushed the Jewish forces back up against the temple walls. It was at this point in the war when fire broke out in the temple. However, there are two stories about how the fire started. The first story says that as two Roman soldiers were fighting close to the temple, they of their own initiative decided to set the temple on fire, as one soldier took a burning piece of wood and the other gave him help up higher onto the wall. One soldier tossed the fire into the temple through a low golden door into the sanctuary chambers. So in this story, supposedly the temple was destroyed despite Titus's order that it be preserved, and despite his attempts to put out the fire once it started, according to the writings of Josephus. The second story says that a historian who came years after Josephus by the name of Sulpicius Severus, who based his story on Tacitus's lost history, says the opposite. He claims that Titus directly ordered the destruction of the temple. It is thought that Titus really did at first want to save the temple, but after months of vicious fighting, decided it best to destroy the temple as a way to dishearten the Jews and try to get them to surrender. So on August the 9th, Titus met with his commanders and decided to burn the temple on the following day, which coincided with the destruction of the first temple by Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon in 586 BCE. The book of Jeremiah supports this at Jeremiah 52, verse 12. Here it says in verse 12, "Now in the 5th month, in the 10th day of the month, which was the 19th year of King Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, who stood before the king of Babylon into Jerusalem. And he burned the house of Yahweh, and the king's house, and all the houses of Jerusalem, even every great house, burned he with fire. All the army of the Chaldeans, who were with the captain of the guard, broke down all the walls of Jerusalem all around. Then Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, carried away captive of the poorest of the people, and the residue of the people who were left in the city, and those who fell away, who fell to the king of Babylon, and the residue of the multitude." So these verses 12 through 15 support that the destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BCE occurred on the 10th day of August in our Gregorian calendar. So Titus chose the meeting date for its historical significance. An attack on the temple on the 10th would have been very auspicious for Roman success and a fateful signal for the Judeans. At any rate, during the battle of the 10th of August, it was hot and dry from the summer heat, and the fire that was set, whether it was planned or not, the fire took off rapidly. The onlooking Jewish forces were greatly shocked to see their temple in flames, as black smoke filled the air. The Jews fought in vain to save their temple, but the fires were out of control. As the fire raged in the temple, the Romans broke through the eastern gate of the temple, what is known as the Golden Gate we discussed in my previous video, and they entered into the temple courts. After 3 months of heavy fighting, the Romans knew the tide had finally changed to their favor, and they gave way to their bloodlust and attacked the Jews en masse as soldiers broke free from their officers and fought each one on his own. The fighting was especially bloody in the temple area itself, as the Romans sought to take the gold for themselves as spoils of war. Josephus provides an eyewitness account of the destruction in the temple, the fire, and the noise, where he says, "You would indeed have thought that the temple hill was boiling over from its base, being everywhere one mass of flame. Yet the stream of blood was more copious than the flames." He observes that this was on the very day and month that the first temple had been burnt by the Babylonians. So that's what Josephus observed about the fire. In their greed and confusion to get the gold in the temple, some Roman soldiers trampled each other to death. When Titus finally arrived on the scene, his presence had little effect on his men, as they, in their frenzied state, continued to slaughter all they saw, and as they looted the temple of everything they could. Finally, the delirium of Titus's men subsided as the temple was picked clean of all gold, and after the fire had consumed what was left of it. So much gold was taken from the temple that the price of gold throughout all of Syria at that time dropped by half the value. Titus takes the Temple Mount, and Titus's soldiers cried out, "Imperator, Imperator," as he entered the Temple Mount. After an especially great victory, an army's troops in the field would proclaim their commander Imperator, an acclamation necessary for a general to apply to the Senate for a triumph. After this, Titus offers an ox, a sheep, and a pig right there in the temple courts to proclaim his God's domination of that over the Jewish God. That was certainly an abomination in the Jewish temple to have the Romans offer sacrifices there to their false gods. Though Titus's army, especially the soldiers of the 10th Legion, likely pestered Titus to sacrifice a pig in the temple, Titus probably already planned to do so for more practical and strategic reasons. Even in the absence of any other motivations, Titus may have intended to sacrifice a pig as a military scare tactic. The Jewish rebels must have believed that God was on their side and would save them from their more numerous but better trained Roman adversary. This appears to be also why Titus entered the Holy of Holies, which Josephus records in his book The War of the Jews in chapter 6. When Titus entered the Holy of Holies immediately before the Romans set up their ensigns in the temple and offered a pig in sacrifice to them, these acts would have been likely performed in an obtrusive, overt, and theatrical manner so as to ensure that the Jews were aware of these impieties. This is because the purpose of these deeds appears to have been to frighten the Jewish rebels into surrendering. If Titus was able to enter the Holy of Holies, worship foreign gods in the temple, and even offer a pig in sacrifice to them, these acts should have sealed Titus's immediate fate. But the fact that Titus was able to perform these blasphemies unmarred sent a powerful message that Yahweh was unwilling to defend his own people. As I mentioned briefly before, the day Jesus died on the cross nearly 40 years earlier, Yahweh ripped the temple veil in half as a symbol that animal sacrifices were no longer needed in the temple because Jesus became our high priest forever, as the Bible says. The Jews, however, because of their lack of faith in Jesus, continued on in their ritualistic animal sacrifices at the temple, which were at that time now offensive to God. When Titus walked into the Holy of Holies in 70 A.D., the Spirit and presence of Yahweh had been absent for nearly 40 years. Though the Temple Mount was now taken, many Jewish forces escaped from the temple's smoldering ruins to the upper city and at Herod's palace to the south. From these locations, the Jews faced off against the legions. But before the fighting commenced, John and Simon, the resistance leaders, asked for a meeting with Titus. They met on the long bridge that connected the temple to the southern cities. According to Josephus, here is some of what Titus said to John and Simon. He says, "When I came near your temple, I again departed from the laws of war and exhorted you to spare your own sanctuary and to preserve your holy house to yourselves. I allowed you a quiet exit out of it and security for your preservation. So if you had a mind, I gave you leave to fight in another place. Yet have you still despised every one of my proposals, and have set fire to your holy house with your own hands. And now, vile wretches, do you desire to treat me by my word of mouth? To what purpose is it that you would save such a holy house as this was, which is now destroyed? What preservation can you now desire after the destruction of your temple? Yet you do stand here at this very time in your armor, nor can you bring yourselves so much as to pretend to be supplicants, even in this your utmost extremity. O miserable creatures, what is it you depend on? Are not your people dead? Is not your holy house gone? Is not your city in my power? Are not your own very lives in my hands? And do you still deem it a part of valor to die? However, if you throw down your arms and deliver up your bodies to me, I grant you your lives. And I will act like a mild master of a family. What cannot be healed shall be punished, and the rest I will preserve for my own use." To that offer of Titus's, Simon and John made this reply, that they could not accept of it because they had sworn never to do so. But they desired that they might leave to go through the temple wall that had been made about them with their wives and children, to go into the desert and leave the city to him. At this Titus had great indignation, that they were men already taken captive, that they should pretend to make their own terms with him, as if they had been the conquerors. So he ordered this proclamation to be made to them, that they should no more come out to him as deserters, nor hope for any further security, for that he would henceforth spare nobody, but fight them with his whole army, and that they must save themselves as well as they could. For that he would henceforth treat them according to the laws of war. So he gave orders to the soldiers both to burn and to plunder the city. who did nothing indeed that day, but on the next day they set fire to the lower city and burnt down all the houses that were full of dead bodies of such as were destroyed by the famine. So Josephus reports those words that were made by Titus and Simon and John there. Well, John and Simon wanted to bargain for surrender, but Titus wanted nothing more than unconditional surrender. After these talks broke down, Simon and John went back to join their forces. The following day after this meeting, as Titus said, he sent his troops into the lower city, and for 2 straight days the soldiers slaughtered everyone they saw, including rebels and non-combatants alike, burning the city as they went. Dead corpses were everywhere in various stages of decay because of the famine. The fire consumed them all, filling the air with a horrible stench. The lower city was totally devastated, and all that remained now was the upper city and Herod's palace. Herod's palace had strong walls, and the palace towers ranged from 450 to 810 feet high. There were also numerous underground passages that allowed the Jews to make surprise attacks on Roman troops. Titus didn't want to deal with the tall walls of the palace, so he attacked from the west, where the walls were much lower. He ordered more siege ramps to be built to start assaulting the wall. He also set up siege works for Simon's Tower, the gymnasium, and the viaduct. It took Titus's soldiers 2.5 weeks to build all his siege works, and on September 7th, Titus began battering down the walls. By this time, the Jewish forces were so exhausted from lack of food that they did not leave the city and attack the siege works as they had done before. The massive boulders from the catapults brought the west wall down, and the Roman armies rushed through the opening in the walls. The Jewish forces abandoned the palace towers, the Hippicus, the Merium, and the Phasial, and went underground to evade capture. They ran in all directions, seeking a way out from certain death. But many were caught and killed by street patrols, while others tried to dig their way out in the underground tunnels. In the end, both Simon and John were captured alive, plus 700 fighting men who were saved to go to Rome to be put on full display for Titus's triumphal return. Josephus describes the Jews who were taken captive. He says, "And now, since his soldiers were already quite tired with killing men, and yet there appeared to be a vast multitude still remaining alive, Caesar gave orders that they should kill none but those that were in arms, and oppose them, but should take the rest alive. Together with those whom they had orders to slay, they slew the aged and the infirm, but for those that were in their flourishing age, and who might be useful to them, they drove them together into the temple and shut them up within the walls of the court of women, over which Caesar set one of his freed men, as also Fronto, one of his own friends, which last was to determine everyone's fate according to his merits. So this Fronto slew all those that had been seditious and robbers, who were impeached one by another. But of the young men he chose out the tallest and the most beautiful, and reserved them for the triumph. And as for the rest of the multitude that were above 17 years old, he put them into bonds, and sent them to the Egyptian mines. Titus also sent a great number into the other Roman provinces as a present to them, that they might be destroyed upon their theaters by sword and by wild beasts. But those that were under 17 years of age were sold for slaves. Now during the days wherein Fronto was distinguishing these men, there perished for want of food 11,000 Jewish people, some of whom did not taste any food through the hatred that their guards bore to them, and others who would not take in any food when it was given to them. According to Josephus, the number of those that were carried captive during this whole war was collected to be 97,000. The zealot leader, John of Giscala, was finally captured by Titus and was sentenced to life imprisonment, taken to Rome and paraded through the streets in chains during the triumphant march. Simon Bar Giora escaped into the subterranean passages of the Temple Mount. By means of stonecutters he tried to dig a way to freedom, but ran out of food before he could finish. Clothed in the garments of a Judean king, he rose out of the ground at the very spot where the temple had stood. He was taken prisoner and brought to Rome. Like kings of other countries, Simon was displayed during the triumphal procession with a rope around his neck and was dragged around Rome. Judged a rebel and a traitor by the Romans, some say that he was executed by being thrown to his death from the Tarpeian rock near the temple of Jupiter, while others say that he was decapitated. Vespasian and Titus celebrated the dearly bought victory together. No expense was spared for the pageant. Crowned with laurel and clothed in purple garments, the two conquerors rode slowly in separate chariots to the temple of Jupiter Capitolinus amid the shouts of the people and the aristocracy. They were preceded by the soldiers in festive attire and 700 Jewish captives. The images of the gods and the sacred furniture of the temple, the table of showbread, the seven-armed menorah, the trumpets which announced the year of Jubilee, and the rolls of the law were borne along in procession and deposited in the newly built temple of peace, except the law and the purple veils of the holy place which Vespasian reserved for his palace. In the end, we have no way of knowing exactly how many were killed during the siege of Jerusalem, but according to Josephus, 1.7 million lost their lives. According to Tacitus, there were 600,000 whose lives were lost. In any case, it was a tremendous amount of Jewish people who lost their lives in the carnage at Jerusalem because they did not heed Jesus' words to flee to the wilderness when they saw Jerusalem surrounded by armies. Instead, many thousands of Jews went to Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover, only to die a gruesome death inside the city. This was most certainly a great tribulation for the Jewish people as a whole. Not only the tragic loss of life, but the loss of their place of worship. Losing the temple meant that the Jews could no longer follow the law of Moses, because they now had no priest to offer sacrifices for them or a temple to do it in. Thus began the rabbinical age where Jews could only gather in synagogues. The Jews were scattered to the ends of the earth to be trampled on by the Gentile nations, just as Jesus had foretold. Okay, I'm going to end this video here. In this video, we saw how Jesus' words and predictions came true to the Jewish inhabitants in the city of Jerusalem in 70 A.D. In my next video, we will see how Jerusalem was only a minor fulfillment of Jesus' prophecy, and that the Great Tribulation is yet future and is tied in with the return of Christ. So stay tuned for that, and thanks very much for watching.